All right, I thought I would do something a little. I noticed I got a clock up here. I guess they're really subtle. They don't want me doing this thing. I can look down and tell. That way I can tell when I'm keeping you too long, right? Well, I thought I would start off today with a biblical joke, all right? And the old timers have probably heard this, so I thought I would start with this. Who was the shortest man mentioned in the Bible? Everybody know? Right? Bildad the Shuhite, one of Job's pals that came, okay? Follow that up. Who was the second shortest man mentioned in the Bible? Nehemiah. All groaning, kidding aside, that's as funny as I get. I'm sorry. I want to spend some time today, though, talking about Nehemiah. Not just Nehemiah, but Nehemiah. And you look, and Nehemiah was not a prophet. He wasn't a king. He wasn't a mighty warrior. And yet, we have an entire book dedicated to his story. Story of this man, what he did. Why is that? I mean, there are many historical events throughout the timeline of mankind that you would think were much more important than the brief history of what happened during this man's life. And yet, we find we pause in history to examine Nehemiah and what he did, his life's work. And when you think of biblical heroes, and that's this weekend's theme, you think of a heroes list, you probably don't have Nehemiah on it. And so today I want to explore this man, what he accomplished at this crucial time in history. And I think there are lessons in there that we can learn. We can see that not only was he a godly hero, but he had aspects then that we can draw upon as well. And of course it helps as we get into the story to get a little background about Nehemiah. And during this period that is portrayed during the book of Nehemiah, there's a whole lot that's going on. And it helps us to understand if we get a grasp of the background of not only what was going on, but who Nehemiah was. And it's only then that we can put all of the things that he did into proper perspective. Now you look at the book of Nehemiah, and like a lot of the other Old Testament books, it's named after the author. In this case, Nehemiah. And you look at it, and Nehemiah, for many, many centuries, and even still by the Jews today, was considered a twin to the book of Ezra. And in fact, they call it 1st and 2nd Ezra, instead of Ezra and Nehemiah. And like we do 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Kings, things like that. And it's also interesting, in addition to Ezra and Nehemiah, Esther was also during this very same period of time. So you have these three books, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. They tell the story of the time period of God's people in the Persian Empire. And what you find, Esther basically stayed behind. So she represented all of those Jews that remained in Persia, where you have Ezra and Nehemiah. They went back to Jerusalem. And so their story picks up of all the Jews that went back to Jerusalem. Now, Ezra and Nehemiah are often considered one entity because the story begins with Ezra and it ends with Nehemiah, but it's the same story. The thread runs throughout both of them. Now, they're different periods of time, but they do spend a small amount of time where they do overlap within Jerusalem. Now, the books both of Ezra and Nehemiah, they trace the story of the return of the people of God back to Judah after their 70 years of captivity in Babylon. And we know they came in three distinct pilgrimages. Ezra says that Zerubbabel came first, and he rebuilt the temple. And then you had Ezra with a second larger pilgrimage back. Ezra restored the temple, the worship within the temple, and he worked an awful lot. You can read through Ezra. He restored a lot of the infrastructure for Jerusalem. And then you find that his commission, he had been granted that commission by the Persian king to be governor in Jerusalem. His commission ended. And although he remained in Jerusalem, he had no authority. He had no power, if you will, from the Persian king. And then what you begin to see is the city of Jerusalem begins to fall into disrepair. And so it is here that Nehemiah's story begins. And you look at it, it's some 70 or 90 years after Zerubbabel. Now Ezra was what you would call a professional religious leader. He was a priest, he was a scribe. That was his profession, if you will. Not so with Nehemiah. He was an administrator. He served in the Persian court. But you see that both Ezra and Nehemiah had a very deep commitment to God and to his way of life. And you could consider both of them to be true Jewish patriots of the time. You know, the book of Nehemiah, we don't have time to go through the entire book, 13 chapters. Within those 13 chapters, you find a lot of lists. You get into all these things of names and people and places and things like that. But there are two main themes. Chapters 1 through 7 talk about the fortification of Jerusalem. And then you have chapters 8 through 13 that describe the rededication of not only the walls, but the Jewish community back to God. So it's kind of a joyous kind of thing that we get into. Now, the book of Nehemiah provides us a great illustration how prayer and hard work can accomplish seemingly impossible things. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And it's when a person determines to trust, to obey God. And we're going to see that Nehemiah was a person of vision, person of prayer, a person of action, cooperation, compassion, one who triumphed over opposition. The great theme of the book is that, even while the Jewish community was small and was weak at that time, God is great and makes up for it. So who was Nehemiah? The name Nehemiah means comfort of Yahweh, or God comforts. Interesting name. And he makes his appearance in the first chapter of Nehemiah, the entire book, and he wrote, you look at it, it appears he didn't write the entire thing, but he definitely wrote the beginning of it and toward the end of it. So he makes his appearance in the first chapter at a place called Shushan, which was where the palace of the Persian king Artaxerxes was. And you'll see in here where he served as a personal cupbearer to the king. And you think, cupbearer, and so he was the guy that tasted and the food and drank the wine before the king to make sure it wasn't poisoned. And you think, would I really want that job? But ironically, it was more than that. We're going to spend almost our entire time in Nehemiah, but let's begin today in Genesis. Genesis 40, verse 2. I just want to bring out here something about this position, if you will, of a cupbearer. And this is not Nehemiah, but this talks about the position of a cupbearer. Genesis 40, verse 2. Now after this, we're going to spend the remainder of our time in Nehemiah, so I'm going to take it easy on you today. But Genesis 40, verse 2. The Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief butler and the chief baker, talking about Joseph when he was in jail. Now drop down to verses 9 through 13. The chief butler told his dream to Joseph, who said to him, Behold, in my dream, a vine was before me. The vine, there were 3 branches, and it was though it had budded, its blossoms shot forth, its clusters brought forth ripe grapes. Then Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, and I pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Joseph said to him, This is the interpretation of it. 3 branches are 3 years. Now within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head, restore you to your place. You will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner when you were his butler. He's clearly talking about the cupbearer again here, but we see that he's called here the chief butler. And you can go and do your research. Non-biblical references mention that the position of a cupbearer, especially in the Persian court, was actually a position of great importance. And it says here, a chief butler. So even more than just tasting the food and drinking the drink before the king, he also would have been one that would have been the keeper of the king's signet ring. His authorization, if you will. he would have been a very high and important advisor to the king, the very highest level of the Persian court. And so you see where God placed Nehemiah in this position, and even though he wasn't, the highest position, he was serving the most powerful ruler in the world at that point in time. And it was done so that God could accomplish his will. And it's interesting when you look at it, you see how many times in the Old Testament especially, how God uses this technique of taking his servants and placing them as close associates with the most powerful rulers of the time. For example, consider Joseph, second only to Pharaoh. Consider Moses, the son of Pharaoh. David was in the court of Saul. You had Daniel, who was a very high advisor. You have all of these people that were right there next to the highest leaders, the most powerful people in the world at that time. And so what we see here is this Nehemiah, he has the king's complete confidence and trust. And it's because of that, then, that the king allowed him to become governor of Jerusalem. And so let's go back to Nehemiah here. Like I said, I'll take it easy on you. We'll begin in Nehemiah 1. Nehemiah 1, verses 2 and 3. Verse 2. Verse 1 basically establishes Nehemiah the son of Hakaliah. It came to pass in the month of Chislev, 20th year, as I was in Shushan, the citadel. So he's at the king's palace. That Hananiah, I guess, one of my brethren came from the men of Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews that had escaped, who had survived the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the survivors that are left from the captivity in the province that are there in great distress and reproach. The walls of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. And so this calls it here, says one of my brethren. And there's some debate whether it's actually his brother or if it was a countryman. This was around 445 BC. And so this gentleman, he brings Nehemiah this disturbing news about the pathetic conditions that the Jewish people were suffering in Jerusalem. Years earlier, under Ezra, they had been allowed to return. And you can read through Ezra. Ezra did some great things with Jerusalem. He had worked hard, tirelessly, to restore temple worship, to rebuild Jerusalem. Unfortunately, his commission from the Persian king had ended. If you had no authority, and we'll see some of this in there, it didn't take much for the surrounding people to encroach on Jerusalem. And so even though Ezra was still there, you had these outside forces that were quickly destroying Jerusalem. Ezra was powerless to stop them at that point. Verse 4. So it was, when I heard these words, I sat down, I wept, I mourned for many days. I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. So we see that Nehemiah here is very religious. He's very close to God. He's seeking God's will. And he's very serious, isn't he? He's fasting and praying. He wants to know what steps he should take. He hears about people in Jerusalem. He wasn't from Jerusalem. He's never been to Jerusalem. But he knew that's where they should be. And so he's asking God for help to rectify this deplorable condition. And his patience was finally rewarded. The king finally consented to his request. And we'll see that Nehemiah was appointed governor of Judea, and he spent 12 years working in Jerusalem along with Ezra. So what were the issues in Jerusalem? The different things that were going on that so concerned Nehemiah. There were several. For example, the rulers from surrounding territories, and we'll read through some of their names, and you'll hear their names mentioned again and again. They liked the fact that Jerusalem was weak, that Judah was weak. And so every time the wall was there, was still there, but it wasn't complete. There were parts that were torn down, so there were holes in the wall. And every time the Jews would try to rebuild the wall, you'd have these people come along and they would knock it down. We see that there were traitors within Jerusalem itself. You see where the high priest and his family, along with some of the nobility, they liked it when Jerusalem was weak, because when Jerusalem was weak, they were strong. We see there was no social justice going on. The poor were basically enslaved to the rich, even though they were all Jews. With no wall, you had where the invaders could easily take the city, and therefore you didn't have a lot of people that lived in the city. Because if they came, you were trapped at that point in time. You see, also the temple was not functioning properly. The Levites had left. They weren't being paid for their services. You got to eat. So they went out. They left. They were out farming, things like that. We also see that the Sabbath was being profaned. It was being ignored by those in Jerusalem. So you had all of these things that were going on. Jerusalem was quite a mess. They had returned from exile, that's true. They had rebuilt the temple, that's true. But the city's infrastructure was in shambles. And so into that scenario steps this administrator from the Persian high court. That was Nehemiah. We're going to see in here, he made it work. But a lot of it was, through his prayer, through the guidance of God. And we're going to see that he personally was kind of a force of nature. You could even say what he did was heroic. He didn't have a cape, didn't wield a sword. He was an unlikely and unheralded hero. We would say a godly hero. The right person at just the right time at this very critical juncture in the history of Judah. So he was this godly hero. So what was there about this man that God was able to use for his success? That's what I want to look at today. I believe that when we're done, we'll see that Nehemiah was what we would call a godly hero. And the traits that he had are traits that we should be able to have as well, so that we can as well be considered godly heroes. First thing I want to notice about Nehemiah, he was prayerful and patient. He was prayerful and patient. We were reading that. He heard the condition in Jerusalem. He prayed and he fasted about it immediately. And like I say, it would be very easy for him. He lived a nice, cushy life. It would have been easy for him to take a step back and say, wait a minute, I don't have a dog in this fight. Why do I need to do all of these things? But he didn't. He heard of the plight of the Jews in Jerusalem. And it says he sat down and he wept and he mourned over the situation. So he'd never been there. And yet he felt that connection. He fasted and he prayed. And we're going to see here, we'll go through his prayer, how it's an example of humility, genuine faith toward his Creator, that God would intervene on his behalf. So let's pick up part of this prayer here. Nehemiah 1, verse 5. And I said, I pray, O Lord God of heaven, O great and awesome God, you who keep your covenant and mercy with those who love you and observe your commandments, please, let's just look here. He begins his prayer. Notice he's praising God for his greatness, for his mercy, for his love for his people. Okay, verses 6 and 7 now. Please let your ear be attentive, your eyes open, that you may hear the prayer of your servant, which I pray before you now, day and night, for the children of Israel, your servants. I confess the sins of the children of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Both my father's house and I have sinned. We've acted very corruptly against you, not kept the commandments, the statutes, nor the ordinances which you commanded your servant Moses. So Ezra had done this too. When you go back and you look at it, he acknowledged the sins of his people. He acknowledged that the Jews had been guilty of sinning against God. And so he's laying it all out there. Verses 8 and 9. Remember, I pray, the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me, keep my commandments, and do them, though some were cast out into the furthest part of the heavens, yet I will gather them from there, bring them to the place which I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. So Nehemiah now reminds God of his promises. This is a tool that we can use in our prayers as well. There's nothing wrong with going and praying before God and saying, hey God, remember you wrote this here. You said this here. These are promises that you made. So that's what Nehemiah is doing. He's reminding God. Remember what you told Moses. Verse 10 says, now these are your servants and your people, whom you've redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. And so now he's bringing it forward. He said, these are your people from Moses. These are the descendants of Moses. And he said, you called these people for a special reason, for a purpose. They needed redemption. Verse 11. O Lord, I pray, please let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant, to the prayer of your servants who desire to fear your name. Let your servant prosper this day, I pray. Grant him mercy in the sight of this man, for I was the king's cupbearer. So he's concluding his prayer, and he's asking God, help me be successful in this. I'm going to go petition the king. Please be with me. Help me to find favor. So even though he did this, he asked for favor and everything, what you see is it would be about 4 months before he even had that opportunity to come before the king, to make his request to be known. 4 months. Chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. Came to pass, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took the wine and gave it to the king, and I had never been sad in his presence before. Therefore the king said to me, why is your face sad, since you are not sick? This is nothing but sorrow in your heart. The king realizes it. He takes notice. This shows you that Nehemiah had a very close relationship with the king. So the king takes notice. Drop down to verse 4. And the king said to me, what do you request? So notice now verse 5. The last part of verse 4 says, so I prayed to the God of heaven. So here he is. He's given this opportunity, and even as he's there to present it, he is quietly praying to God. He's got this silent prayer going on in the background, if you will, asking God for favor. Here's my chance. God, please inspire me, direct me. We see Nehemiah's humility. Notice also his attitude. He's not demanding anything from God. He's not begging for anything for God. And he's getting to his point across while keeping God first and foremost. One of the striking characteristics of Nehemiah when you read through the entire book was how quickly he turned to prayer. Time and time again, we find that he prayed to God. But what you see with Nehemiah, his prayers were proactive. He knew what he wanted. And so he goes to God first. God, this is what I would like. This is what I'm thinking. With that humble attitude. Now, Nehemiah wasn't one of these, and how often do we do this? You stumble into a problem or a trial, right? And then you're on your knees, aren't you? Boy, praying, help me get out of this. Help me with this problem. That's not what Nehemiah did. We see with him this evidence of a life lived in constant communication with God. He had that relationship. So a godly hero is one that leans on God first and foremost, even if you don't get the answer you want right away. Let's look at point number 2 here. Even though Nehemiah put his trust, his obedience to God, he also prepared himself. So that's point 2. Always be prepared. Always be prepared. We're in Nehemiah 2. Let's go read verses 7 through 10. So here he's talking to the king in verse 7. It says, furthermore, I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given to me for the governors of the region beyond the river, that they may permit me to pass through till I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he must give me timber to make beams for the gate of the citadel, which pertains to the temple, for the city wall, for the house that I will occupy. And the king granted them to me according to the good hand of my God upon me. Verse 9, I went to the governors in the region beyond the river, And I gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent captains of the army and horsemen with me. Then Sanballat, the Horonite, and we'll see Sanballat's name throughout here, and Tobiah, another character that shows up quite often, the Amorite official, when they heard that, they were deeply disturbed that a man had come to seek the well-being of the children of Israel. So even though the whole region at this point in time was under Persian control, Nehemiah knew that there would be an issue with these surrounding governors. And so, when they figured out somebody new was coming to town, he knew they wouldn't be happy. So he's heading them off. He'd already thought through this. He headed them off. He asked the king for letters so that he could present it to them. This guy's coming through. He's going to be the governor of Jerusalem, and he has my authority. So he heads them off. And we see here the king also had a small military force with him. And they went to go visit these two gentlemen, the Sanballat and Tobiah, before then he went to Jerusalem. Just so that they would know there's a new sheriff in town and he's got authority. Now, he knew that that wasn't going to provide complete protection, but we also see where he's doing his due diligence with that. He's not being foolish. He trusted that God would take care of him, and yet at the same time, he wanted to make sure he had done everything humanly possible that could be done. And so we see here this divine working, along with human planning, don't have to be contradictory. They can work in concert, exactly how Nehemiah did it. Let's continue on with the story, verse 11 through 16. I came to Jerusalem, and I was there 3 days. I arose in the night, and I and a few men with me. I told no one what my God had put in my heart to do at Jerusalem, nor was there any animal with me except the one on which I rode. I went out by night, the valley gate, to the serpent well, and the refuse gate, and I viewed the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and its gates, which were burned with fire. And I went to the fountain gate, to the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal under me to pass. So I went up in the night, by the valley I viewed the wall, and I turned back, and I entered by the valley gate, and so returned. The officials did not know where I had gone, or what I had done. I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, or the others who did the work. So Nehemiah is in the city for 3 days before he even really makes his presence known. And as it says here, he would go out at night secretly by himself on his horse. He personally inspected what was left of the wall. And he does it without any fanfare. He doesn't do it with anyone else even knowing. And he did it so that by the time he got all the leaders gathered together, there was already a plan in place. There wouldn't be no arguing or anything like that. He would already know what had to be done, who was going to do it, and that they would get picked up, get the instruction. They were going to be responsible for it. And so let's look at the result of his pre-planning, verse 17. And I said to them, so he's not asking anything, right? You see the distress that we're in, how Jerusalem lies waste and its gates are burned with fire. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer be a reproach. And I told them of the hand of my God, which had been good upon me, and also of the king's words that he had spoken to me. So they said, let us rise up and build. And they set their hands to do this good work. And so that's what he does. He gets them inspired. He doesn't give them that chance to argue in order to be what we consider today the devil's advocate. You see so much of that. No, he said, this is what we're going to do. I want you to be a part of it. And we're not going to go through chapter 3 because you see a lot of that is this account of who worked on the wall and where. So you're going to see a lot of names in there of who these people were. So we're not going to go through all the names or anything, but we do need to note a couple of things. What we see through there, all members of society helped with the task. From the high priest, to the local rulers, to the skilled craftsmen, even to the women and the children. And you see there, those outside of Jerusalem actually came to Jerusalem to work on the wall alongside those that lived there. And so this gave everyone a sense of ownership, created unity, it created synergy. Now, another thing that Nehemiah did that was pretty bright is he would assign people to work on the wall that was closest to their home. I mean, for a short walk, but also, if you're in the city, what part of that wall is most important to you? The part right outside where you live. And so he got everybody's buy-in. So that's what he did. And everybody is on board with that. Let's go to chapter 4 now, verses 7 and 8. Chapter 4, verse 7. So it happened when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Amorites, the Ashdodites had heard that the walls of Jerusalem were being restored, the gaps were beginning to be closed, they were very angry. And all of them conspired together to come to attack Jerusalem, to create confusion, just like they had done in times past. Verse 11, our adversaries said they will neither know nor see anything till we come into their midst and kill them and cause the work to cease. And so just as Nehemiah had feared, just as they had done in the past, you had all of these governors that surrounded Jerusalem. They began to see that the walls being fixed up and being built, they become angry. And over the years, they'd kind of gotten used to that. The Jews are building the wall, will attack them, will tear it down again. So make no mistake about it, people died during this. People attacked them. This was no undertaking to be taken lightly. They were putting their lives on the line. So you begin to see where people are dying here. So what did Nehemiah do? Verse 16. Verse 16. So it was from that time on, half of my servants worked at construction, while the other half held the spears, the shields, the bows, and wore armor, and the leaders were behind all the house of Judah. Verse 17, those who built on the wall, those who carried burdens, loaded themselves, so that with one hand they worked at construction, the other hand they held a weapon. Every one of the builders had his sword girded at his side as he built. And the one that sounded the trumpet was beside me, the one that blew the warning. Now that doesn't mean they only worked with one hand. It meant that they were armed when they went. And you had people whose job it was to be dedicated, half of them, to protection detail, while the other half worked. And it says here the workers always had a sword right there at hand, even while working. So Nehemiah worked tirelessly to rebuild the wall. Despite all the efforts of the enemies and everything, what you read in there, that wall was miraculously completed in 52 days. It's less than 2 months once they started. It was a massive undertaking. You would say it was a miracle that it got done. And so Nehemiah shows us that godly heroes don't just happen by accident. Just by being the right place at the right time. What he's saying is being a godly hero requires prayer. Requires thinking ahead. It requires hard work. May even require self-defense. There is effort in being there. Look at the next point. He was personally courageous. He was personally courageous. Let's go over to chapter 6 now. Read verses 1 through 9. Nehemiah 6, beginning in verse 1. We're going to see our two friends here. It happened when Sanballat, Tobiah, we have a third one in here, Geshem, the Arab, the rest of our enemies heard that I had rebuilt the wall, and there were no breaks left in it, though at the time I had not hung the doors on the gates. So the wall was completed, but the gates are not hung yet. Sanballat and Geshem sent to me, saying, come, let us meet together among the villages on the plain of Ono. But they thought to do me harm. So I sent messengers to them, saying, I'm doing a great work. I cannot come down. Why should the work cease while I leave it and go down to you? And they sent me this message 4 times, and I answered them the same way. Then Sanballat sent his servant to me, as before, the 5th time, with an open letter in his hand. This is what was in the letter. It's reported among the nations, and Geshem says that you and the Jews plan to rebel. Therefore, according to these rumors, you are rebuilding the wall that you may be their king. You may also appoint prophets to proclaim concerning you in Jerusalem, saying, there is a king in Judah. Now these matters will be reported to the king. So come, therefore, let us consult together. And I said to him, saying, no such thing as you say are being done, but you invent them in your own heart. For they were trying to make us afraid, saying, their hands will be weakened in their work, and it will not be done. Notice here what he says, kind of a prayer, isn't it? Now, therefore, O God, strengthen my hand. So even in this, he is praying to God. Well, we see these guys again, Sanballat, Tobiah, and this time this gentleman by the name of Geshem. So when they understood that they couldn't tear down the walls this time, they attempted to harm Nehemiah 5 times. They're trying to set up a meeting. They're going to ambush him. Probably want to kill him. So Nehemiah, he's smarter than that. He's having none of it. He denies the meeting each time. Now notice this 5th time here that was different. In this letter, Sanballat says basically they were going to tattle on Nehemiah. I'm going to send a letter back to the Persian king. And we're going to tell the king, you built this wall, you hung the gates, you're going to claim yourself to be the king of Judah. So Nehemiah, he's taking the threat seriously because this gentleman, Geshem, was actually a relative by marriage to the Persian king. So you had to take it seriously. Something to notice here, he called it an open letter. So in those days, the letters were written on these scrolls, and you would roll them up, and you would put a band around them, and you'd have a seal on it. And that seal wasn't to be broken until the recipient received the letter and broke the seal. An open letter was not that way. It didn't have the seal or the band on it. And so what you saw is that anybody, and in many cases everybody, would read the letter. So all along the way, you would have all these people reading this letter that says, hey, Nehemiah wants to be king of Judah. So you're spreading rumors around all over the place. Would have added further confusion. What's Nehemiah do? He challenges the letter. That wasn't right. Because of that, it didn't have the intended effect. So they were being pretty sneaky about it. Let's continue on verse 10 through 13. Afterward, I came to the house of Shemaiah, the son of Delaiah, the son of Mehetabel, who was a secret informer. And he said, let us meet together in the house of God, within the temple. Let us close the doors of the temple, for they are coming to kill you. Indeed, at night they will come to kill you. And I said, should such a man as I flee? And who is there such as I that would go into the temple to save his life? I won't go in. And I perceived that God had not sent him at all, but that he had pronounced his prophecy against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. For this reason he was hired, that I should be afraid and act that way and sin, so that they might have cause for evil report, that they might reproach me. So it's kind of a double plot here. They plot, first of all, to lock him in the temple. You get locked in the temple, there's only so many places you could hide there. It would have been easy prey at that point. And if he'd been killed, the workmen would have scattered at that point in time. They would have stopped and fled. But notice here, even if they didn't try to kill him, the suggestion here is that Nehemiah takes sanctuary in the temple. Nehemiah wasn't allowed in the temple. That was only for the priests to go in the temple. Nehemiah wasn't that priest. If he had gone into the temple, he would have been disqualified as a leader. He would have been shown to have been a fraud. So with this, we see where godly heroes use discernment. Even when it's something that's outside of their comfort zone, they take action to do what's right, just as Nehemiah did. Next point, he was willing to sacrifice for others. And even though Nehemiah was the authority, representative from the king, we see that he and his family didn't take money from the people. They didn't acquire land. They didn't personally benefit at all from being there. Let's go back to chapter 5. Chapter 5, verse 14 through 16. says, moreover, from that time, I was appointed to be governor in the land of Judah. And from the 20th year until the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes, so 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the governor's provisions. But the former governor, who were before me, laid burdens on the people, took from them bread and wine, besides 40 shekels of silver. Yes, even the servants bore rule over the people, but I did not do so, because of the fear of God. Indeed, I also continued to work on this wall. We did not buy any land. All my servants were gathered there for work. So the people that the governor ruled would have provided for the governor. They would have given him his food, his salary. But Nehemiah wasn't concerned about the high life there. He was more focused on the wall. Let's continue on, verse 16. Indeed, I also continued to work on the wall. We did not buy any land. All my servants were gathered there for work and ate at my table, and at my table were 150 Jews and rulers, besides those who came to us from the nations around us. And verse 18. Now that which was prepared daily was 1 ox, 6 choice sheep. Also fowl was prepared for me, and once every 10 days in abundance of all kinds of wine. Yet in spite of this, I did not demand the governor's provisions, because the bondage was heavy on this people. Now Nehemiah, as a high court official back in Persia, when you think about it, would have been a wealthy man. He would have been used to the finer things in life. But that's not what we see that he did here. He paid his own way. He paid for his servants. He fed all of the people out of his own pocket. So he's truly an outstanding servant of God. He was willing to set that high standard that God had set, even if it meant personal discomfort. He's spending his own money to support all of this. You know, it's very similar to what Paul did in the New Testament. We see that very same attitude. Nehemiah gave up what was legitimately his due. You know, the food, the salary, those kind of things, in order to provide a good example for those that he led. And so we see that a godly hero has that outgoing concern for his fellow man, much like Nehemiah did. Final point, Nehemiah had zeal for God's way. And we don't have time here to go through where he finished the wall, and then he repaired the gates, and then along with Ezra, he dedicated the wall and the temple again. It's quite a ceremony. It takes several chapters to go through. Again, you'll see lists of people that are doing these different things. And you see in there where the people wanted the law read to them. And we go through this a lot of times during the fall festivals, but it was during these fall holy days that this all occurred. It's quite a remarkable story. You know, the people stood, the law was read to them, was explained to them. Nehemiah saw to it that the city was populated. He had people come in from the outside, so that there were people in the city once it was fortified and protected. He saw to it that the temple was running smoothly. He invited the Levites back. He started paying them their salary so they didn't have to go farming. You see all these tithes and offerings. Everything was coming in. It was all working. Let's jump to the end of the book here. Jeremiah 13. I encourage you sometime to sit down and read through the entire book of Nehemiah. It helps too. Start with Ezra. It kind of picks up the whole story going all the way through. Nehemiah 13, verse 6. It says, but during all this, I was not in Jerusalem. For in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had returned to the king. Then after certain days, I obtained leave from the king. So after 12 years, he was, if you will, recalled back to Persia, to the king. It says for a short time. You look up that phrase in the different commentaries, and they think that it was a period of about a year. So it was a relatively short period of time. Let's go back to verse 6. or not to 6, to verse 4. Verse 4. Now before this, Eliashib the priest, having authority over the storerooms of the house of our God, was allied with Tobiah. So we see Tobiah showing back up here. And then in verse 5, he prepared for him a large room where previously they had stored grain offerings, frankincense, the articles of tithes of grain, the new wine and oil, which were commanded to be given to the Levites and the singers and the gatekeepers, and offerings for the priests. So Tobiah shows back up on the scene. He is allowed in into these storehouses. You kick out all the money and everything that was in there, and you've given it to this Tobiah fellow. So he's now set up shop at the temple. What does Nehemiah do? Nehemiah comes back. Let's notice verse 7. I came to Jerusalem, discovered the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah in preparing a room for him in the courts of the house of God. Verse 8. And it grieved me bitterly, therefore I threw all the household goods of Tobiah out of the room. Nehemiah's not happy. He's not a happy camper here. So he goes and he physically takes all of Tobiah's stuff and he throws it out to the curb. But he finds out, that wasn't it. That wasn't all of it. He found the priests had been cheated. And the Levites were now going back to farming because they hadn't been paid. And so he restores the money that belonged to them. And then he discovers that throughout the city, people had been violating the Sabbath. They were allowing vendors to come in on the Sabbath to do their trade, bringing in their merchandise, buying and selling in the streets. Verse 19. So it was at the gates of Jerusalem, as it began to be dark before the Sabbath, I commanded the gates to be shut, charged that they must not be opened till after the Sabbath. I posted some of my servants at the gates so that no burdens would be brought in on the Sabbath day. So he closes the gates right before the Sabbath. Nobody's getting in. Nobody's getting out. And what he discovered, that there were actually some of them that would wait outside the doors all night, hoping someone would come out and to do a little business. So what did he do? Verse 21, I warned them, and I said to them, why do you spend the night around the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you. From that time on, they came no more to the Sabbath. Lay hands on you. That doesn't sound pleasant. Okay, they got the picture. They did it a couple of times, and then he threatened them, and no more. They got it. Then he discovered another problem. People were still intermarrying with the forbidden races around them. Nehemiah becomes violent at this point in time. Notice verse 25. I contended with them, cursed them, struck some of them, pulled out their hair, made them swear by God, saying, you shall not give your daughters as wives to their sons, nor take their daughters for your sons for yourselves. Now that's pulling out hair. Now pulling out the hair of the beard was not only painful, but it was a very public display of shame for a man. So Nehemiah's not messing around here. But that still wasn't all. He found even the grandson of the high priest had married outside of his race, and that was forbidden for anybody that was in line to be the high priest. Now, to make matters worse, she was a daughter of one of his fiercest enemies, this guy, Sanballat again. Verse 28. One of the sons of Jehoiada, the son of Eliashib, the high priest, was the son-in-law of Sanballat the Horonite. Therefore, I drove him from me. Kicked him out. Now, it's easy to say, Nehemiah, he was being pretty severe. But think about the case with Jesus Christ at the temple when he drove out the money changers. What was said of Christ? He said, the zeal for your house has eaten me up. Nehemiah is doing the very same thing. Like Christ, Nehemiah was a man that learned you don't compromise between good and evil. He held the line. So the fact that Nehemiah didn't move back to Persia when he was done building the wall, when he had secured the city, it shows that his concern wasn't just for these projects. He knew there was a larger goal, a goal of reestablishing the Jews in the land. Now, God had given him that commission. following their exile, and they kept failing. Nehemiah wanted to see God's plan fulfilled. He was putting God's interest before his own. So godly heroes have a godly zeal for his work. So Nehemiah proves that seemingly impossible things are possible. Through prayer, through hard work, and people determined to trust, to obey God, to do what he says. And they put his interest first. You look at Nehemiah, he gave up a life of leisure. He had it easy. He undertook an arduous journey. He faced daunting obstacles. Why? He wanted a better Judah. He wanted Jerusalem to be fixed. He wanted all of these problems, physical and religious, to be resolved. He wanted to give. He didn't want to get. And he came not once, but twice to make sure everything was set up and that it was running. He focused on the greater good. He was not focused on himself. So no portion of the Old Testament provides us with a greater incentive to have a dedicated, discerning work for God. We see that no finer example than Nehemiah. He had a passion for following God, for his work, for his word, no matter the cost, no matter the consequence. It's an example I think we could all use today. Times are tough. Can we be a hero like Nehemiah? So, like many times since, and even today, what we see is Nehemiah's greatness comes from asking great things of a great God, and then attempting great things while relying upon him. That's a secret that we can use today. That is an example of a godly hero. So let us strive to have those qualities as we continue on our journey towards the kingdom of God.